The snow was falling thick and heavy, blanketing the world in a perfect, pristine white. I watched it swirl past the cabin window, sipping my coffee, feeling that kind of warm, contented glow that only came from being with the person you loved, in a place where no one could reach you. At least, that was how this trip was supposed to feel. I turned my gaze to Ethan, who sat across the room, staring at his phone with an expression so focused you'd think he was analyzing the stock market instead of whatever mundane thing was on his screen. His jaw was tight, his thumb scrolling absently, and for the 10th time that day, I told myself not to read too much into it. Maybe he was just stressed. Maybe he wasn't ignoring me on purpose. I forced a smile and set my mug down on the wooden table between us. "The snow's getting worse," I said, trying to sound casual. "It looks beautiful, though. Maybe we could go for a walk later?" Ethan didn't even look up. "Mm-hmm." Okay, not exactly enthusiastic, but I could work with that. I tried again. "We could take some pictures, like we used to." "You always said I looked cute in the snow." Nothing. Just another nod, another distracted murmur that might have been agreement or might have just been an automatic response to get me to stop talking. I swallowed, pushing down the ache in my chest. He had been like this all weekend. Distant, irritable. Like being alone in this cabin with me was a chore, rather than something he had planned. And the worst part? I had no idea why. I stood up, moving toward him, setting my hands on the arm of the chair. "Ethan." That got a reaction. A slow blink. A sigh, and finally, he lifted his gaze to mine. His eyes, usually warm and full of something that made my stomach flutter, were now just flat, cold. "What?" he asked, voice clipped. I hesitated, thrown off by the sheer lack of emotion in that single word. My fingers curled against the fabric of the chair, and suddenly, all the words I'd been holding back for days came spilling out. "Have I done something wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Because you've been acting weird ever since we got here. You barely look at me, and you're always on your phone." Ethan exhaled sharply, sitting up straighter. "Jesus, Grace, can we not do this right now?" My stomach twisted. "Do what?" "This." He waved a hand vaguely. "This thing where you always need constant reassurance, where you start spiraling the second I don't give you all my attention." I blinked. "That's not what I'm doing." "That's exactly what you're doing." His tone was different now, sharper, meaner. My throat tightened, and I felt a familiar, awful feeling creeping up my spine, the same feeling I had whenever we fought. Like I was shrinking, like he was pulling me apart piece by piece, and I was scrambling to put myself back together before he decided he didn't want me anymore. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Ethan, I'm not asking for constant attention. I feel like something's off, and I don't know why. If something's wrong, just tell me." He let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "God, Grace, you're exhausting." I froze. I had expected an explanation, a reason for why he was being distant. Not that. Not that. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes flashing with irritation. "You always do this, you know? You always make everything about you. Like, I don't have my own shit going on." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "I'm not trying to— I mean, do you even hear yourself?" He scoffed, pushing to his feet. "I bring you to this damn cabin, and instead of just enjoying it, you start overthinking everything, dragging me into some stupid argument." "I'm not trying to fight with you," I cut in, my voice shaking now. His eyes narrowed. "Then what are you doing?" "I'm trying to understand you." The words came out louder than I intended, bouncing off the wooden walls, swallowed almost immediately by the sound of the howling wind outside. The storm was getting worse. The cabin creaked under the weight of it, and for some reason, that made my chest ache even more. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore," I stilled. "What?" "This," he gestured between us. "You. Us. It's exhausting, Grace. You're—" He huffed, looking away. "You're too much." I had never felt colder in my life. My ears rang, my pulse pounded. I searched his face, waiting for some sign that he was just lashing out, that he would take it back, that he would realize how cruel he sounded. But he didn't. He just crossed his arms over his chest and said, "You know what? Maybe you should go clear your head. Take a walk. Get some air." My lips parted. "Ethan, there's a storm." And he arched a brow. "You wanted to go outside earlier, didn't you?" Something deep in my gut twisted, and for the first time, I saw it. Really saw it. He wasn't just snapping at me. He wasn't just angry. He wanted me gone. And that hurt more than anything else he could have said. Fine. Fine. I turned on my heel, grabbed my coat, and marched to the door. If he wanted me to leave, I would. And when he realized what a mistake he'd made, when he finally understood how much I meant to him, then he would be the one running after me. I threw open the door, and the wind hit me like a slap. The cold bit through my coat, sharp and merciless. My boots sank into the snow, and I barely managed to slam the door shut behind me before the gusts nearly ripped it off its hinges. I took a few steps forward, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts, my hands shaking. Not just from the cold, but from rage, from hurt. He'll come after me? He had to. But the minutes stretched, and the wind howled, and the snow kept falling, and the door behind me, it never opened. I turned back, my heart racing, and reached for the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the wood, calling his name, but there was nothing. No sound, no footsteps, just silence. And that's when I knew. Ethan had left me out here. He had left me to die. The storm swallowed my screams, my pleas, and soon my body started to go numb. My fingers, my toes, my lips. I stumbled, falling onto my knees, the snow seeping into my clothes, sinking into my bones. I was going to die out here. And then, through the blur of swirling white, I saw it. A figure. Not Ethan. Not human. Just standing there, watching me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. The cold was pulling me under, deeper, deeper. And the last thing I heard before the darkness took me was a whisper. Not yet. Then, everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, lungs heaving like I had just surfaced from drowning. My body lurched forward, the sheets tangled around my legs, the air around me too warm, too still. Not cold, not like before. For a moment, I couldn't think, couldn't process where I was. My skin still felt numb, my fingers tingling as if the frost had burrowed deep inside them, refusing to thaw. The last thing I remembered was the snow, the wind howling like a living thing, the ice clawing up my legs as the cold swallowed me whole. And then, Ethan had left me out there. That thought hit me like a hammer, and my head snapped to the side, searching, scanning, my breath ragged. I expected to see nothing. Maybe the blinding white of the storm still raging outside. Maybe the shadowy figure I had seen just before I died. Instead, I saw Ethan, lying peacefully beside me, his breathing slow and steady, his features relaxed in the dim morning light. Like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't died. My pulse pounded in my ears, my body frozen in place, waiting for some kind of explanation, some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe the cold had played tricks on me. Maybe Ethan had let me back in, and I had passed out before I could remember. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 7:23 a.m., the same time we had woken up yesterday, the same time I had woken up the day I died. The thought made my stomach churn. I sat up slowly, pressing a hand to my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of my heart as if confirming I was really here, really alive. Had it all been a nightmare? A vivid, horrifying dream? I turned toward Ethan again, half expecting to see some sign that he had changed overnight, that he remembered what had happened. But when he finally stirred, blinking blearily at me, all I saw was the same tired disinterest he had shown me yesterday. He didn't look shaken. He didn't look haunted. He looked normal. "Why are you staring at me?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Nothing," I said, my voice hoarse. "Just weird dreams." Ethan let out a groan, rolling onto his back. "Well, can you have your existential crisis quietly? Some of us are still sleeping." I felt my stomach twist at the familiar words. He had said that yesterday, word for word. A sense of dread slithered up my spine. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood, my body still aching, still expecting to feel the deep cold seeping through my bones. I walked to the window, hesitating before pulling back the curtain. The storm was there, just like before. The snow, the wind, the endless white swirling just beyond the glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to shake off the feeling of déjà vu creeping over me. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But as the morning played out, I realized with a sinking certainty, this wasn't just déjà vu. It was exactly the same. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. The coffee Ethan ignored on the table, the way he kept checking his phone, barely engaging with me, his expression cold, distant. Every moment was identical to yesterday, and no matter how much I tried to brush it off, the pattern was too perfect to ignore. I tested it. When I asked if he wanted to go for a walk, he barely looked up from his phone. Maybe later, he muttered, voice distant, just like before. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to do something different, to react in a way he hadn't before. But everything, every word, every sigh, every movement was exactly the same. And when the fight finally started, I braced myself. I had fought back yesterday, had begged him to tell me what was wrong. This time, I tried something different. I didn't fight at all. I nodded at his frustration. I agreed when he snapped at me. I told him. I understood when he said I was too much. None of it mattered. The result was the same. By nightfall, I was outside in the snowstorm, staring at the locked door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And when I pounded my fists against the wood, pleading, screaming, Ethan ignored me again. The wind howled, the ice crept up my skin, I collapsed into the snow, and I died. Again. I woke up gasping. The sheets were tangled around my legs. My skin was warm. The clock on the nightstand blinked 7:23 a.m. Ethan was beside me, breathing evenly, like nothing had happened. No, 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 no. I sat up so fast my vision blurred, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. My body ached, my fingers still tingling like they remembered the frost that had buried me alive. I scrambled out of bed, moving toward the window, throwing open the curtain. The storm was still there. It was still happening. I pressed a hand to my head, dizzy with confusion. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But then Ethan groaned, shifting beside me. Why are you staring out the window? His voice was the same, the exact same. I turned slowly, heart hammering, my hands trembling as I watched him stretch, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't aware. He had no idea. I had died twice, and he was just resetting, completely untouched, completely unchanged. I wasn't dreaming. I was trapped, and I had no idea how to escape. The third time, I fought harder. I tried to run before the fight even happened, but the storm blocked the roads. I tried to make Ethan care, tried to plead with him before it was too late. But his reaction was the same: irritated, dismissive, uninterested. I told him something was wrong, that I was having horrible déjà vu, that I felt like I was going insane. He laughed, and when night fell and the storm raged and I found myself outside again, I banged on the door so hard my fists bled. He didn't let me in. And just before the cold took me, before the darkness pulled me under, I saw it again. The figure, standing in the storm, watching me. But this time, it stepped closer. The last thing I heard before I died was a voice. Not yet. The fourth time, I screamed. I screamed when I woke up. I screamed into my pillow. I screamed until my voice cracked, until I had nothing left in my throat. Ethan barely reacted. "You seriously need to chill out," he muttered. I stared at him, truly stared at him, and realized how utterly and completely alone I was in this. Ethan wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to remember. And no matter what I did, the day would always end with me dead in the snow. Unless I figured out how to stop it. Unless I broke the loop. The fifth time I woke up, I didn't scream. I didn't panic. I didn't bolt upright in bed, gasping for air like I had been drowning in it. Instead, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to Ethan's slow, even breathing beside me. I didn't need to check the clock to know it would be 7:23 a.m. I didn't need to pull back the curtain to know the storm was still raging outside. It was always the same, down to the smallest details, like a perfectly written script being performed over and over, and I was trapped in the starring role, forced to act out the same tragic ending on repeat. This time, I refused to play along. I rolled out of bed carefully, quietly, my movements slow and deliberate. Ethan didn't stir as I grabbed my duffel bag from the closet, stuffing it full of clothes without bothering to fold them. The last time I had tried to warn him, to change his mind, to make him care, I had ended up outside in the snow again, my body shaking from cold and rage, my fists bleeding from pounding on the door he refused to open. This time, I wouldn't wait around for the inevitable betrayal. I was getting out before it even had the chance to happen. I zipped up the bag and slung it over my shoulder, heading straight for the front door. My heart pounded as I gripped the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. I pulled it open, and the icy wind hit me instantly, biting at my exposed skin. Snow had already piled up on the porch, high enough that I had to step over it, my boots sinking deep with every step. The road wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk if I moved fast, and I knew there was a gas station a few miles down. If I could just get to it, maybe I could break the loop. I didn't make it that far. By the time I reached the road, I realized I wasn't alone. The storm was worse than before, the wind so strong I could barely keep my balance, snow whipping against my face hard enough to sting. But through the thick white haze, something moved. A figure barely visible, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, its shape wrong, shifting like it was flickering between being solid and being made of the storm itself. I took a step back, my stomach twisted. My breath came out in harsh, uneven gasps. I didn't know why, but I knew. I knew that if I got any closer, if I tried to leave, it wouldn't let me. And I was right. The moment I stepped toward the road, the wind howled louder than before. And suddenly, I was falling. The ground beneath me had disappeared. I barely had time to scream before the snow swallowed me whole, dragging me down, 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 into an endless, suffocating cold. When I woke up, I was back in bed. 7:23 a.m. The next time, I refused to go outside. I locked every door. I pulled the curtain shut. I turned up the heat as high as it would go and waited. If the storm wanted me dead, it would have to come inside to get me. At first, it seemed like it was working. Ethan was just as indifferent as always, glued to his phone, only vaguely acknowledging me when I passed through the room. I ignored him. I ignored the way he sighed when I tried to talk to him, the way his jaw tightened when I reached for his hand. It didn't matter. I just had to survive the night. But then, sometime around midnight, the power cut out. The cabin went completely dark, the heater shutting off with a dying whir. I sat up in bed, my breath already coming out in visible puffs, the temperature dropping too fast, too suddenly. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, but the screen flickered and went black before I could unlock it. Then, I heard it. The wind wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside the cabin, rushing through the walls, creeping under the door, curling around my ankles like fingers made of ice. I clutched the blankets around me, my body shaking. But it wasn't enough. Within minutes, I was freezing to death. I tried to move, to call out for Ethan, but my lips wouldn't part. My body wouldn't listen. It was as if something had pressed down on my chest, holding me in place as the cold crept up my spine, sinking its claws into my ribs. The wind whispered in my ears, something just out of reach, something I wasn't meant to understand. Then the darkness took me. I woke up at 7:23 a.m. The next loop, I tried something even riskier. I tried to fix things with Ethan. I didn't push him. I didn't start a fight. I smiled at him, touched his arm, laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. I told him I loved him, that I was grateful for this trip, that I wanted to make things work. I watched his reactions carefully, listened for any shift in his tone, any hesitation, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was working. He smiled back. He kissed my forehead. He told me I was sweet, that he was glad we were here together. And then, as night fell, he still locked the door. I pounded on it. I screamed for him, begged him to let me in. His voice was muffled, but I heard it. "You're always so fucking needy, Grace." And then, silence. I sank to my knees, my hands going numb against the wooden door, my throat raw from shouting. And as the cold wrapped around me again, as my vision blurred, I saw it. The figure, standing closer this time, watching, waiting. And as I took my last breath, I finally understood. The storm wasn't just killing me, it was testing me. The last time, I snapped. I stabbed Ethan in the throat with a kitchen knife before he could send me outside. The moment the blade slid in, the moment his eyes went wide, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a deep, hollow kind of emptiness. The blood soaked his shirt, his hands clutching at the wound as he gasped out something I couldn't hear. And then before his body even hit the floor, I woke up. 7:23 a.m. No matter what I did, I still died. No matter how I fought, no matter how I ran, no matter what choices I made, the ending was always the same. The cold would take me, the storm would pull me under, and the figure in the snow would watch it happen. But now, I knew something else. It wasn't just killing me for fun, it wanted something. And until I figured out what that was, it would never let me go. The 20th time I died, I stopped trying to fight it. I let the cold take me without struggling, without screaming, without pounding on the locked door until my fists bled. The moment I collapsed into the snow, I let my body sink into it, let my eyelids flutter shut, let my breath slow until there was nothing left but the hush of the wind and the creeping darkness. I didn't fight to survive because surviving didn't matter anymore. I had already learned that the loop wasn't about me fighting my way out. It was about something else. Something deeper, something I still didn't understand. But there was one thing I did know. The storm wanted something from me, because each time I died, it was there. The shadow, the figure standing just beyond my reach, watching, waiting. Every time I took my last breath, every time my vision faded, I saw it. Tall, blurred at the edges, shifting like it was part of the storm itself, woven from the wind and the ice and the howling dark. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a hallucination. It was something else entirely. And if I was ever going to break free, I had to stop running from it. The next time the loop restarted, I woke up with a single thought in my head. Watch the storm. I stopped trying to change things with Ethan. I didn't try to leave early. I didn't try to manipulate him into loving me again. I didn't even try to survive the night. I simply observed. I paid attention to everything. The way the wind rattled the cabin at night. The way the cold seeped in no matter how high I turned up the heat. The way the snowstorm never seemed to lessen, never seemed to end. It wasn't a normal storm. It wasn't even a real storm. It was alive. It moved with intent. It shifted when I did, adapting, responding to every action, every attempt I made to escape it. It was playing a game with me, and it was winning. So I waited. When the inevitable came, when Ethan locked the door, when I was cast out into the freezing dark, when the cold began to creep into my bones, I didn't fight it. I walked forward. Not toward the cabin, not toward safety, but toward the figure. It was there, waiting for me, just like it always was. And this time, I didn't stop moving. The closer I got, the harder it became to breathe. The wind wasn't just wind anymore. It was a force, a presence pressing against me, pushing me back. But I kept going, my legs moving even as my muscles burned, even as my skin turned numb, even as my mind screamed for me to stop. Then, just as the last of my strength faded, just as I dropped to my knees in the snow, I heard it. A whisper. You already know the answer. My heart slammed against my ribs. I tried to speak, but my lips wouldn't move. I tried to reach out, but my fingers were frozen in place. The figure stood before me now, looming, shifting, its edges curling into the wind like it was made of the storm itself. I forced out a breath, my voice barely a whisper. Who are you? No answer. The storm roared, swallowing my words, the cold sinking deeper, deeper. And then I was gone. When I woke up in the cabin again, I knew. I knew the loop wasn't about saving myself. It was about Ethan. It was about his regret. Except there was no regret. He woke up every morning oblivious, uncaring, unaffected. He didn't carry any guilt, any sorrow. Every single loop. He locked the door without hesitation, without remorse. He didn't even hesitate, because in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. And that was why I was trapped. That was why I kept dying. Because until he felt what I had felt, until he truly understood what he had done, the storm wouldn't let me go. The next few loops were different. I didn't fight Ethan. I didn't try to argue, didn't beg for his attention, didn't try to change the inevitable. Instead, I started planting seeds. I started watching for hesitation. The first time, I let the day play out normally, but right before he locked the door, I whispered, "You'll regret this." The second time, I waited until the fight started and simply said, "Ethan, does this feel right to you?" The third time, I didn't say anything at all. I just stared at him, silent, watching, waiting, and it worked. I saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. A brief, fleeting moment of uncertainty. His hand hovered over the lock for just a second longer than before. He swallowed hard. His gaze darted away. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a crack. And cracks? They grew. I tested it, over and over, pushing him further each time, forcing him to confront what he was doing. One loop. I waited until the moment he locked the door, then pounded on it and screamed, "Ethan, I'm going to die!" Another loop, I pleaded, "If you do this, I'll haunt you forever." And another, I didn't beg at all. I simply whispered, "Remember me." Each time his reaction was different. The first few times he was annoyed, dismissive, brushing me off like a nuisance. But then, he started hesitating. He started looking uneasy, shifting his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. I could hear it in his breath, see it in the way he lingered by the door for just a second too long. And finally, one night he didn't lock it at all, but it was too late. The storm was stronger than ever, the wind screaming, the cold tearing through my skin. I stumbled forward, reaching for the handle, and then I saw it. The figure. Standing right in front of the door, blocking my way. I gasped, stepping back, my pulse thundering. I had never been this close to it before. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a shape, a face, Ethan's face. I choked on a breath, my mind spinning, my body trembling as I stared at it, at him. What is this?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head, and this time, when it spoke, the voice wasn't a whisper in the wind. It was Ethan's voice. "You already know the answer." Then the wind rushed forward, consuming me, pulling me under, burying me in the cold. And I died. Again. When I woke up at 7:23 a.m., I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, everything clicking into place. The storm wasn't just killing me. It was Ethan. It was his absence, his apathy, his refusal to acknowledge what he had done. Every time he ignored me, every time he dismissed me, the storm grew stronger. And the figure, his reflection in the storm, was proof that deep down, some part of him knew what he had done. He was the one keeping me here. The loop would only end when Ethan felt true, unbearable regret, when the pain of losing me finally outweighed his indifference. And if that meant I had to break him, piece by piece, loop by loop, then so be it. I stopped pleading with him a long time ago. The first few loops, I thought words could save me. I thought logic, reason, love could force him to see me, to really see me, not just as something disposable, something replaceable, but as a person, someone who loved him, someone who trusted him, someone who he had left to die. But words had never worked on Ethan, not when he was convinced he was right. Every argument ended the same way. Every desperate attempt to break through that calculated indifference only pushed him further into himself. Let him convince himself that this was just another one of my overreactions, another one of my emotional spirals. I should have known better. So I stopped talking, I stopped fighting, and then finally something changed. The first time he followed me outside, I almost didn't believe it. It wasn't part of the loop. It wasn't something I had ever seen before. and the break in routine made my heart slam against my ribs in a way that almost hurt. I had been standing in the snow, watching the wind curl around me, waiting for the familiar feeling of my body giving out. When the door creaked open behind me, I turned slowly. Ethan stood in the doorway, bare feet against the wooden porch, his face half shadowed, half lit by the soft glow from inside. His breath was uneven. That was new. He wasn't just irritated or impatient, wasn't rolling his eyes or muttering something under his breath about how I was so dramatic. No, he looked off balance. For the first time, he looked afraid. He stepped forward, just slightly, and it wasn't a confident movement. It was hesitant. He was trying to mask it, but I saw it. I saw the way his fingers curled and uncurled at his sides, how his throat bobbed when he swallowed, how his gaze flickered, not at me, but at the storm behind me. He was seeing it now. Maybe not the same way I did. Maybe not as clearly, but the storm wasn't just wind and snow to him anymore. Wasn't just an inconvenience. I could feel it. Feel the moment that cold curled into his ribs the way it had done to me for so many nights. He was finally feeling it. The weight of it. I should have been happy. I should have been triumphant. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? But instead, I just felt tired. Because it wasn't enough. Ethan, I said, my voice steady, emotionless. I watched him stiffen at the sound of his name, watched him blink like I had pulled him out of a trance. What are you doing out here? His lips parted, but nothing came out. I let the silence stretch between us, let him feel it, the way I had felt it, the way I had drowned in it, night after night after night. Then, finally, he spoke. I don't know, he murmured. And for once, it wasn't dismissive. It wasn't defensive, it was honest. I tilted my head, my gaze unmoving, unblinking. You do. He exhaled, his breath visible in the freezing air, curling between us like smoke. And then he stepped forward again. I should have backed away. I should have let the wind take me like I always did. Should have let the loop reset so I could try again. Try something different. But I didn't. I stood my ground. Ethan reached out, hesitated. His fingers hovered just above my wrist. I didn't move. I let him feel the distance, the unbearable space between us. Come inside, he said. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a request. It was something else entirely. Desperation. He was desperate. But it was too late. I smiled, slow, steady. You left me to die, Ethan. His face twitched, his whole body going rigid. And now, I continued, voice almost gentle, you will live with it. Something flickered in his eyes, something almost human. He reached for me. The wind took me first. The moment the cold wrapped around me, I felt the weight of it, the familiar pressure in my lungs, the way my limbs turned numb before I even hit the ground. But for once, I wasn't focused on the pain. I was focused on Ethan. He wasn't just standing there this time. He wasn't just watching. He was running toward me. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear him anymore. The wind screamed, the snow curling around my vision, the world fading. But before the dark took me, before the storm swallowed me whole, I heard it. His voice, screaming my name. And for the first time, I knew he was afraid. I woke up at 7:23 a.m., but this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, like the loop itself had shifted, like the rules were no longer as solid as before. I turned my head to look at Ethan, expecting the same routine, the same apathetic sigh, the same groggy irritation. Instead, I found him already awake, sitting up, watching me. And in his eyes, I saw it. The first sliver of real, actual regret. Not just confusion, not just annoyance, regret. The loop had changed, because he had changed. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't know if it meant I was closer to escaping, or if it meant that the loop would twist and shift to hold me here longer, to take something else from me. But I knew one thing for certain. He was breaking, and soon he would have to feel everything I had felt. Every ounce of terror, every shivering breath, every heartbeat slowing in the dark. And then, only then would I finally be free. He was sitting up in bed, arms resting against his knees, staring at the wall with a blank, unfocused expression. His breathing was uneven, his jaw clenched tight, his fingers digging into his thighs like he was trying to ground himself. It took him a long moment to notice I was awake. When he finally turned his head, I braced myself for the usual irritation, the sigh of exhaustion, the "what are you looking at?" dismissal. But it didn't come. Instead, his eyes flickered with something close to fear. Not quite awareness, not quite recognition, but something dangerous. He shifted, rubbing a hand down his face before muttering, "Weird dreams." I stilled. My blood turned cold. Ethan didn't dream. At least, he had never mentioned them before. Never woken up like this. Never looked like something was pressing into his mind, refusing to leave. And if he was dreaming, that meant the loop was starting to leak into to him. I had never gotten this far before. I sat up, careful not to move too suddenly, not to shatter whatever fragile thread was unraveling inside of him. "What kind of dreams?" I asked, voice even, measured. Ethan hesitated. That hesitation was everything. "Nothing," he muttered, pushing off the bed, moving toward the bathroom like he could shake off whatever was clinging to him. He was lying. I knew he was lying, and that meant something inside him was fighting this now. I just had to push him the rest of the way. The morning played out as usual, but it wasn't the same. Ethan kept glancing at me. He was restless, more silent than usual, but not in the cold, dismissive way I had grown used to. His hands were shaky when he poured his coffee. His jaw was tight when he scrolled through his phone, staring at the screen without reading a word. The cracks were there. He just didn't understand them yet. But he would, because today was different. Today was the last loop. By evening, the weight in the air had doubled. The storm outside was worse than ever. The wind rattled the cabin walls, howled through the cracks in the wood, crawled under the doors, like it was trying to force its way inside. And Ethan felt it. I could see it in the way he paced, in the way his fingers tapped against the table, in the way he kept looking at the window like he expected to see something staring back at him. He didn't understand why, but he was afraid. It was working. So when the fight started, when I made sure it started, I watched him closely. I let my words come sharp, biting, carefully controlled. I let him snap back, let him think he was winning, let him push the conversation in the direction it always went. And then, at the final moment, I switched the script. Instead of storming outside like I always had, instead of playing my part, I turned away. I moved toward the door, toward the danger of the storm, like I had finally given up. And Ethan, he hesitated. He stood there, frozen, watching me, his fingers twitching like he wasn't sure whether to let me go or stop me. For the first time, he was choosing, and that hesitation changed everything. The storm roared, louder than it ever had before. I was still inside when the power cut out. The heater died. The lights flickered, then went dark. The entire cabin plunged into silence, except for the wind outside. No, not just outside. Inside. I could feel it curling around my ankles, slipping through the walls, whispering between the floorboards like a living thing. And Ethan? He was panicking. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, heard the way they were uneven, rushed. And then he was there, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, his face pale, his eyes wide in the dim, shifting light. Grace. I met his gaze, waiting, watching. "You need to..." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You need to tell me what's happening." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean!" He took a step forward, his voice rising, his breathing fast, unsteady. "Something's wrong. This storm, this whole night, it's not normal." I smiled. He was breaking. Finally. "You're remembering," I murmured. Ethan's face twisted. "What?" "You don't understand it yet," I continued. "But you're starting to feel it, aren't you? The weight of it, the pieces that don't fit." His jaw clenched. He didn't want to admit it, but I saw it. He was remembering me. He was remembering the storm. He was remembering every single time he let me die. Then, for the first time, he begged. He grabbed my wrist, not rough, not forceful, but desperate. "Don't go outside," he whispered. I stilled. The words hung between us, the wind howling through the cabin, the figure in the snow waiting just beyond the door. He had never said that before. I could feel it shifting around me, the loop shaking, distorting, unraveling. And that's when I knew. I had won. I pulled away from him, stepping backward toward the door. Ethan's breath hitched, his entire body tensing. I smiled. Then I turned and walked outside. The storm swallowed me instantly, but this time, Ethan followed. He ran after me, barefoot in the snow, his voice breaking as he screamed my name. He reached for me. He caught my wrist. He held on. But it wasn't enough. The wind tore us apart, pulling me deeper, farther. The figure in the snow standing between us, watching, waiting. I didn't fight it. I let it take me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because I knew what would happen next. Ethan would remember, and he would live with it for the rest of his miserable, broken life. The wind should have hurt. It should have burned against my skin, the cold seeping into my bones like it always did, turning my blood to ice, slowing my breath until it stopped altogether. Every time before, it had been the same. The storm taking me, consuming me, dragging me into the darkness where my body would finally give up. Every time before, I had fought against it or accepted it, waiting for the loop to restart, waiting to wake up in that same cursed cabin with the same cursed man who never remembered what he had done. But this time, it wasn't cold. The wind curled around me, but it didn't bite. The snow swirled beneath my feet, but it didn't pull me under. The air was sharp, crisp, fresh, alive. Not suffocating, not heavy with the weight of inevitability. And that's how I knew. I had broken the loop. It was over. I took another step forward, and the cabin behind me didn't try to call me back. I didn't hear Ethan's voice chasing after me, didn't feel his hand wrapping around my wrist, didn't see him barreling through the snow in a last-ditch effort to stop me. He wasn't coming this time, because he had already lost. And now, he had to live with it. The wind shifted, curling around me, moving ahead, parting the thick curtain of white as if guiding me forward. And standing there, waiting for me like always, was the shadow. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I met its gaze, or what I assumed was its gaze, steady, unblinking, unwavering. It didn't move. It didn't flicker or shift or dissolve into the air like smoke. It was still now, solid, real. It wasn't just a watcher anymore. It was something more, something final. I took another step closer, my breath steady. My fingers weren't numb. My toes weren't tingling with frostbite. My lungs weren't filled with the sharp ache of freezing air. For the first time in what felt like eternity, I wasn't dying. The shadow tilted its head, and when it spoke, I understood the words. His regret has come, but it is too late. And just like that, it was gone. The wind stopped, the snow stilled, and I fell. Not into the storm, not into death, but into something else entirely. I woke up, for real this time. Not in the cabin, not in the loop. I woke up in a hospital bed. My body felt heavy, like I had been asleep for days, weeks. There was a steady beep, beep, beep. To my left, the rhythmic hum of machines keeping track of my vitals. The air smelled sterile, sharp with disinfectant. My mouth was dry, my limbs sore, my skin burning as if I had been left out in the cold for too long. Because I had been. For so many nights, I had frozen to death over and over again. But my body, my real body, had only gone through it once. I blinked slowly, my vision adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights, my ears picking up the faint hum of voices outside the room. I was alive. I was free. The loop was gone. The storm had let me go. And Ethan? Ethan was nowhere to be found. Ethan never recovered. Not really. He left that cabin a different man than the one who had walked into it. And when people asked him why, when they tried to understand what had happened up there, he never gave them a real answer. Because the truth wasn't something he could explain. At first, he tried. He told people he had been through something strange, something impossible, something that had shattered reality around him. But the more he talked, the more people looked at him like he was insane. They called him delusional. They told him he was confused, that he had suffered trauma from losing me. And when he tried to insist that I had been there with him, that I had died over and over, that I had walked into the storm and disappeared before his eyes, they called him a liar, but he knew. He knew, because it never left him. The storm, it followed him. He woke up in the middle of the night, his skin cold and clammy, his breath coming in short gasps, his ears still ringing with the sound of the wind howling outside his window. He started seeing me in places I wasn't. A reflection in a shop window, a figure on the other side of the street, a voice in the wind when no one else was around. And it got worse. The nightmares, the dreams where he was the one trapped in the storm, pounding on a door that wouldn't open, screaming for someone to save him. And no one did. 1 year later, Ethan returned to the cabin. He hadn't meant to. He told himself he never would. But he couldn't stay away. Not when the storm still whispered his name in the dead of night. Not when he still woke up reaching for a door handle that wasn't there. Not when he still saw me. So he went back. The cabin was just as he left it, empty, frozen in time, like it had been waiting for him. He walked inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his steps. The air smelled stale, untouched. He expected it to feel safe, familiar. It didn't. It felt wrong. The storm was coming. He could feel it. He could hear it, gathering in the distance, rolling in through the mountains, curling toward him like a living thing. And then he saw it. My footprints, leading from the cabin out into the snow. But there were none leading back. His stomach twisted. His breath hitched. And then before he could move, before he could turn back, before he could escape, the door slammed shut. And outside, the wind began to howl. Ethan never left that cabin. Not really. The next morning, the locals found his car still parked outside, the engine cold, the keys still in the ignition. But the cabin was empty. No Ethan, no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for the footprints in the snow, leading from the cabin out into the storm, and none leading back. The storm had let me go, but it had taken him instead. And that was justice.